people love iconic brands because they look inevitable in hindsight, as if success was always encoded in their logo, their name, their destiny. But what almost no one wants to sit with is the uncomfortable truth that many of the brands we admire today spent years standing on the edge of collapse, quietly preparing to disappear, while the world assumed they were untouchable. I know this feeling intimately, not as a global brand, but as a founder who once believed that recognition meant safety only to learn the hard way, that familiarity does not pay bills and reputation does not stop cash flow from bleeding out. The stories of near failure are rarely told honestly because they disrupt the fantasy that greatness is linear, that once you make it, the struggle ends, when in reality the most dangerous phase often comes after you think you've already won. Iconic brands almost fail, not because they forget how to succeed, but because success changes the environment faster than they change themselves. And the habits that once made them great slowly turn into liabilities. I've watched companies coast on past victories, mistaking legacy for relevance, assuming customers will stay loyal simply because they always have, until one day the numbers no longer lie, and denial becomes more expensive than change. The early warning signs are always there: declining margins, shrinking attention, internal complacency. But when a brand has history, those signals are easy to rationalize away, because admitting danger feels like admitting weakness, and iconic brands hate to look weak. What history edits out is how close many of these companies came to the end, how boardrooms filled with confident voices slowly gave way to tense silences, how leaders stared at charts that told a story no one wanted to read, and how the fear of destroying the brand's image delayed the very decisions that could have saved it sooner. Comebacks are not born from inspiration. They are born from desperation mixed with clarity from the moment when illusion finally breaks and reality is allowed back into the room. I remember my own version of that moment when the numbers forced a conversation I had been avoiding, when I realized that loyalty to the past was quietly sabotaging the future, and that continuing as we were was no longer brave, it was reckless. Iconic brands reach this same crossroads where they must choose between protecting what they were or fighting to become something new. And that choice is never clean, because reinvention always offends someone. Employees who built their identity around the old way resist change. Longtime customers complain. Partners hesitate. And leadership must absorb all that resistance while moving forward anyway. The myth suggests that comebacks are driven by bold vision, but more often they are driven by humility, by the willingness to admit that what once worked no longer does, and that the market does not owe you loyalty simply because you were once great. Some of the most famous brand revivals began with brutal internal audits, with leaders asking questions. No one wanted to answer questions about bloated structures, diluted focus, forgotten customers, and cultures that had grown comfortable instead of sharp. I've learned that failure rarely announces itself as catastrophe. It creeps in quietly disguised as stability, as good enough as incremental decline that feels manageable until it suddenly isn't. For iconic brands, the danger is amplified because their size slows reaction time, their success attracts bureaucracy, and their history creates emotional attachment to decisions that no longer serve the present. The comeback stories we celebrate later often hide the human cost of this transition. The layoffs, the abandoned products, the public criticism, and the internal fractures that come with tearing down what once defined you. Leaders in these moments are not celebrated. They are doubted, attacked, and blamed because choosing change means choosing short-term pain in exchange for uncertain survival. I've sat in rooms where those choices were made, where every option felt wrong, and where doing nothing felt deceptively safe. And I understand why so many brands wait too long, hoping the market will correct itself or that a trend will reverse. But markets do not reward nostalgia, and time is ruthless with those who hesitate. Iconic brands that survive near-death experiences do so because someone eventually takes responsibility for reality, not appearances, and acts decisively even when the outcome is unclear. These comebacks often start small, with a renewed focus on the core customer, with fewer products, done better with sharper messaging that remembers why the brand mattered in the first place, not to investors, but to real people. The untold truth is that comeback phases feel nothing like triumph. They feel like controlled retreat, like admitting loss in order to regain footing, and that humility is difficult for organizations built on confidence. I've watched brands strip away layers of excess, cut beloved but unprofitable lines, and endure public narratives of decline, all while quietly rebuilding the fundamentals that made growth possible again. What separates brands that recover from those that vanish is not creativity alone, but discipline. The willingness to make boring, consistent improvements instead of chasing dramatic reinventions that look good in headlines but fail in execution. Comebacks demand cultural change, not just strategic change, because the behaviors that led to decline are embedded in how people think, decide, and avoid accountability. This is why many attempted turnarounds fail, because leaders change the strategy without changing the incentives, the habits, and the internal conversations that created the problem. Iconic brands that almost failed had to relearn how to listen, how to test assumptions, how to move faster without losing coherence, and how to rebuild trust with customers who had quietly drifted away. I've learned that trust is easier to lose than to regain, and that comebacks are slow, not because companies lack resources, but because credibility must be earned again, one interaction at a time. The public only sees the moment when the brand is declared back, when profits return, or relevance is restored. But behind that headline are years of uncertainty of leaders wondering if the effort will be enough, or if they are simply delaying the inevitable. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to save something that once thrived, because you are fighting not just the market, but memory comparison and the constant question of whether the world has simply moved on. And yet, when a comeback does work, it reshapes the organization in profound ways, instilling a respect for fragility, a bias toward relevance, and a cultural memory that success must be defended daily. The most resilient, iconic brands carry the scars of near failure quietly, not as marketing stories, but as internal discipline, as a refusal to assume permanence, as a constant reminder that decline is always closer than comfort suggests. I've found that these experiences create a different kind of leadership, one less interested in ego and more focused on signals on learning early on, acting before pride becomes fatal. The real lesson inside comeback stories is not that failure makes you stronger, but that honesty makes survival possible. Honesty about customers, about performance, about culture, and about the gap between who you think you are and how the world actually sees you. If you strip away the mythology, iconic brands that almost failed were saved not by genius, but by the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and to endure the backlash that comes with change. And just when stability begins to return, when the numbers stop bleeding and the brand feels relevant again, a new tension emerges quietly because survival has been secured, but the memory of how close everything came to ending still lingers, shaping decisions, sharpening focus, and reminding everyone involved that this recovery is not a victory lap, but a fragile equilibrium that must be protected because the market is already moving again. competitors are already adapting, and the next test is forming just beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment when vigilance slips and complacency whispers that the danger has passed. And it is right here at this uneasy point between recovery and relapse that the story does not conclude, but continues into the next phase, where the brand must prove whether it has truly learned from the edge it once stood on, or whether it will repeat the same mistakes under a different set of circumstances. Because the sentence of this journey, like the comeback itself, does not end cleanly. Here, it pauses only briefly mid-thought as the brand steps forward into a future that will test whether the lessons of near failure have truly taken root, and whether the humility gained in crisis will survive success as the story moves forward into what comes next, where the real meaning of a comeback begins to reveal itself, and the path ahead demands once again that difficult choices be made, starting with the next decision, the next response, the next moment, when comfort tempts you to forget how close you once came to losing everything. And the sentence continues as the pressure builds and the future presses in, waiting to see whether this time the brand is ready to face what comes next without flinching. Because the real test of any comeback begins only after you think you've survived it. And that test is waiting right now, just beyond this point, where the story carries on and the next chapter begins. Right as you step forward into a phase that will decide whether this recovery becomes resilience or just a temporary pause before the next fall. And that decision starts in the very next moment as the journey continues and the words trail off here unfinished. Because what comes next will define everything that follows. And the sentence must move on into the next part, where the true cost and the true meaning of these comeback stories finally comes into focus, where the real danger quietly returns, not as collapse, but as comfort. Because once a brand survives its near-death moment, the instinct is to exhale, to believe the hardest part is over, when in fact, this is the phase where relapse becomes most likely. I've seen it happen more times than I care to remember, organizations that fought their way back from the edge, only to slowly drift into the same patterns that almost killed them, because vigilance is exhausting and memory fades faster than anyone expects. The comeback phase teaches a brutal lesson that success regained is more fragile than success. First achieved because it sits on top of scar tissue, on teams that remember the pain, on customers who are still watching closely, waiting to see if the change was real or just a temporary performance. Iconic brands that truly complete their comeback understand this tension and choose discipline over celebration, knowing that the market does not reward effort, only consistency over time. I remember the moment when our own numbers finally stabilized, when the panic stopped dictating every decision, and instead of relief, what I felt was a heavier responsibility, because now there were no excuses left, no crisis to hide behind, only the question of whether we had actually learned anything. This is where leadership is tested in a quieter way, in the daily refusal to slide back into old comforts, in the willingness to keep making hard calls even when no one is forcing your hand. The brands that endure after near failure institutionalize humility, not as a slogan, but as a system building feedback loops that surface bad news, early rewarding those who speak up, instead of those who protect appearances, and staying obsessively close to customers, even when growth returns. What most people never see is how much restraint goes into a real comeback, how many tempting opportunities are passed over, how many expansions are delayed, how often leaders choose focus over ego because they understand that relevance is maintained, not reclaimed once and forever. I've watched iconic brands walk away from short-term profits because they recognized the early signs of distraction, and those decisions looked foolish to outsiders until years later, when competitors who chased everything slowly lost their identity. The deeper truth is that a comeback is not an event. It is a new operating mode, a permanent awareness that decline begins the moment you assume stability. This awareness reshapes culture, replacing entitlement with curiosity, replacing nostalgia with relevance, and replacing blind confidence with earned conviction. Employees who live through near failure carry a different posture, less impressed by hype, more attentive to fundamentals, and that collective memory becomes one of the most valuable assets a brand can have if it is honored rather than suppressed. The danger comes when new growth attracts people who did not live through the crisis, who inherit the success without understanding its cost. And it is leadership's job to transmit that hard-earned wisdom without becoming cynical or fearful. I've learned that the strongest brands tell their comeback stories internally, not to glorify suffering, but to anchor standards to remind everyone that nothing here is guaranteed, and that relevance must be earned again every single day. Over time, if this mindset holds something rare happens, the brand stops chasing validation and starts building durability, making decisions that may not trend on social media, but quietly compound trust. This is the phase where iconic brands become resilient brands, not because they believe they are special, but because they behave as if they are replaceable, constantly asking what would make a customer leave and addressing it before they do. Looking back, the most successful comeback stories share a common thread. Not brilliance, not perfect timing, but the courage to stay uncomfortable even after the danger passes. That courage is what turns a near failure into a foundation instead of a fluke, and it is what separates brands that survive a crisis from those that are permanently changed by it. If you strip away the logos and headlines, these stories are about the same human struggle founders face at a smaller scale: the fight against complacency, the discipline to keep learning, and the humility to accept that the market is always right eventually. And if you are building something of your own, whether a startup or a personal brand, the lesson here is not to fear failure, but to fear denial, because almost every collapse is preceded by a long period where the truth was visible but inconvenient. The iconic brands that came back did so because someone chose to face that truth early enough and had the stamina to live with the consequences of change long after the crisis faded from public memory. If this journey resonated with you, if you've felt that uneasy space between recovery and relapse in your own work, then subscribe to this channel so we can keep talking honestly about what it really takes to build something that lasts, and leave a comment sharing which comeback story, personal or professional, taught you the hardest lesson, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear as they stand at the edge of their own turning point.